You can all hear me? Okay, so let's start off from where we left last Wednesday. So we are still going through fundamentals of financial markets. We covered what interest rate was last Saturday. And then on Wednesday, our extra lesson, our focus was mainly on risk structure of interest rate and term structure of interest rate. What was the question that risk structure of interest rate was giving us the answer for? Why do securities, even though they have the same maturity dates, I have two securities, both of them are going to mature in 3 months' time, but still both of them are giving me two different interest rates. Why is that? Okay, so risk structure of interest rates was giving us the answer for that. What was the answer given by the concept? Look here, even though maturity is the same, the risk and the liquidity of both these securities are different. In addition to that, informational cost of searching about the borrower is also different. Due to these three reasons, even though both securities have the same maturity, they are going to have two different interest rates. So what is the security that's going to have the lowest interest rate? Security which has low or zero default risk. Security which has the highest liquidity. Security which has the lowest informational cost. Okay, note that down. Which instrument, even though maturity is the same, if there are two securities and one security has a higher interest rate than the other. Okay, so we are going to pick the security which has the lowest interest rate. Same maturity. Let's take an example. You have two securities. Both of them are going to mature in 3 months. But one is giving you 3%, whereas the other is giving you 6%. Okay. Now you know these two are different. The interest rate is different due to three reasons. Default risk, liquidity, third one being informational cost. So if default risk is high, can you compensate with a low interest rate? No. To give the investor a low interest rate, the default risk has to be lower. Here, the interest rate is either return, the price you pay for the borrowed money is high, which means the default risk of the borrower should be relatively or in comparison to the other security, relatively higher. When we talk about liquidity, when liquidity is high, it's already attractive. No need for you to compensate with an additional higher interest rate. Therefore, you can offer a low interest rate for that particular security. So, liquidity should be higher for you to offer a low interest rate. But if it's an illiquid asset, an asset that you cannot liquidate so soon, can you compensate that or can you offer it to the market with a low interest rate? People will say, you are giving me a low interest rate and I can't sell it in the market as well. What's the point? So for a low liquidity or an illiquid asset, yes, you need to offer a higher interest rate so it's more attractive to the investor. Informational cost. If the informational cost is higher, we saw the interest rate expected is also high because I'm spending my time and cost searching about you before I invest. So I need to be compensated for that time, for that cost. So for you to get a low interest rate, that means the informational cost involved should be low. Here, informational cost involved should be higher. Okay. So this is like the summary of how the risk structure of interest rate works. Then we move to the more hefty part of the lesson. Term structure of interest rate. What was term structure of interest rate telling us? Okay, you have two securities now. Both these securities have the same risk and liquidity characteristics. But still, they are giving you two different interest rates. And term structure told you that one reason for this to happen is the differing terms to maturity. What do you mean by terms to maturity? That's the time period or length of time left until your principal amount is given to you. Now, when you invest like 5 million on a bond. Okay. So let's say you invested for 5 years. Each year maybe you will get interest. But when will you get your 5 million that you initially invested? At the end or on the last interest period. So at the end of the 5th year, you will receive your principal. So the term to maturity or maturity period would be the time until your principal amount comes to you. In this example, the 5th year. Okay. Here, because we were able to quantify both interest rate and terms to maturity, we can plot it on a graph. And that graph, when you draw the relationship between interest rate and terms to maturity, what do you get? You get a yield curve. Yield curve highlights or is a graphical representation of the relationship between interest rate and terms to maturity. Now, so many students, when they write, now one of the easiest question you could get is what is the yield curve? Okay, that's like the easiest question you could get. But still, there are students who don't answer that properly. Why? You write it correctly saying yes, a relationship between interest rate and terms to maturity. But what most common errors done is, one is they say it is a upward sloping curve, which is wrong. Yield curve can take that shape, but doesn't mean yield curve is always upward sloping. No. So when you're writing about what a yield curve is, you should say it's a graphical representation of the relationship between interest rate and maturity of a particular type of bond. Okay, so I told you, if you get a yield curve for one type of a security. Now, if you see this could be the yield curve of a treasury bond. Okay, it can't be, now this point can't be treasury bond, this point can't be debenture. Or the entire scenario, the relationship is highlighted for one particular security. Okay. After that, maybe when you build up for your answer, you could say, yes, yield curve could take 4 shapes. And one such common shape that you see is upward sloping yield curve. Okay. So we saw what are the common shapes that a yield curve could take: upward sloping, downward sloping, flat yield curve, and then a variant of the flat yield curve is the humped or the bell-shaped curve. Now, when you see or when they give you a humped or a bell-shaped curve, what is the keyword there? Short and the long term are relatively flat, but in the immediate or in the medium term, you expect the interest rate to rise and interest rate to fall. Okay, whereas in the other scenarios it's pretty straightforward, and you need to know what a yield curve shape indicates to you. So if it's an upward sloping curve, which means the general public have a positive sentiment that market is going to pick up, market activity is improving, you expect a growth in the economy. But if it's a downward sloping curve where short-term securities are having a higher interest rate and long-term is going to end up with a low interest rate, that's going to highlight to you a recessionary period. Okay, a flat yield curve indicates to you future uncertainty in terms of growth and development. Okay, we saw that with examples as well. Then we moved on to the theories which are going to explain you the shapes. We saw 4 shapes, and there were 4 theories telling you, look here, this can be the reason for the yield curve to take this shape. Okay, they had their own assumptions. Okay, remember the 4 theories. What the 4 theories are? Very first one is expectation theory. That's like the base of the theories. Then you had liquidity premium theory, which was a extension of the expectations theory. Then you had market segmentation theory. No, not at all related to expectations or liquidity premium. It's a standalone, different idea. Okay, market segmentation theory. As an extension of market segmentation liquidity premium, you had preferred habitat theory. Remember the 4 names. Okay, and there each one we saw what their key assumption was, what is their underlying basis. Okay, and then how each of them helped in justifying the shape of the curve. Okay, now today I told you on Wednesday itself, an easy way for you to study the theories is, okay, first you go through the note and you build up your own summary so that it's easy for you to understand. Okay, each time you go through the note, it might be difficult for you to recall. If you have a summary, it's going to be easy for you. Okay, knowing how good you all are, I have developed a summary which I would upload in coming week. Now this is just for your easy reference. Okay, so in one shot you can see the differences between the 4 theories. Okay, so first we are going to see what were the key assumptions of these 4 theories. Okay, what was the heart of the theory? Now, what was expectations theory telling us? Expectations theory told us, look here, interest rate of a long-term security is equal to the average of the future short-term interest rates that's going to occur during the life of the long-term security. Now, if you're just new for today's lesson, it will be Greek to you. But if you went through Wednesday's lesson with the numerical example, you should be able to understand. Okay, if you take a 5-year bond, interest rate of a 5-year bond is equal to the average of the mathematical average of the short-term interest rate. What do you mean by short-term? Remember when we went through the money market, I told you money market is a introduction to the money market. When we went through the classifications, I told you it's a market for short-term securities. There, what was the gauging factor? It was if it was less than 12 months. If it was less than 1 year, we consider it as a short-term interest rate. Short-term. Okay. So here, what they mean by short-term is, in a particular, okay, not here. In a particular diagram, when you draw up your yield curve, let's say you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Now you have a 5-year debenture. The interest rate of this 5-year debenture depends on the average of the short-term interest rates. So what do you mean by short-term interest rate? Now in the year 1 alone, now this is one particular year. So in that one particular year, that short-term interest rate. Second year, in this second year, just the standalone second year, the interest rate. Then the third year, the standalone interest rate. Fourth year, the standalone interest rate. Then again, now during the life of the security, so even the 5th year you need to take. So you will take the 5th year as well. Okay. When you add all 5, divided by 5, then you would get the interest rate of a 5-year bond. That was what advocated by the expectations theory. So that highlighted to you a very close relationship between short term and long term. It was the short term interest rates that decide the long term interest rate. Okay. Average of future short term interest rate. Why is there a word called future? Because if you are standing in this particular point in today's time and assessing, you are looking at the second year short term interest rate, which has not yet happened. It's in the future. Third year short interest rate, which is happening in the future. Fourth year short term interest rate, which is happening in the future. And 5th year short term interest rate, which is happening in the future. Okay, I hope you're clear. Then liquidity premium theory. It was a extension of the expectations theory. So interest rate of a long-term security, yes, as said by expectations theory, it depends on the short-term interest rates expected. In addition to that, now you have an addition plus. On top of that, you need to have a premium paid, a liquidity premium or a term premium. Now there are certain texts which call it liquidity, certain texts call it term premium. So be ready for both the words. Okay. Liquidity premium or term premium for holding a longer term bond. Why? Because investors are exposed to higher interest rate risk when they invest in a long-term bond. Okay, to compensate for that higher interest rate risk, you need to have a liquidity premium added on. Market segmentation theory, what was that advocating you? That was like one of the easiest theory. It was simply telling you, look here, there is a market for each maturity. Now, if you look here, it says there is a market for each maturity. Okay, and these markets are standalone. They don't interact with each other and they are independent of each other. Okay, so interest rate at one maturity is determined separately based on demand and supply of bonds for that maturity. Now, you do get a yield curve now. Let's say it's an upward sloping yield curve. Okay, so for 1 year, this is the interest rate. Second year, this is the interest rate. Third, this is the interest rate. Fourth, the fifth. Okay. Now, market segmentation theory says, look here, this interest rate depends on demand for 1 year bonds and supply for 1 year bonds. Okay. Here, demand for a 2-year bond and supply for 2-year bond and demand for 2-year bonds. Okay, so they are standalone demand and supply forces decide the equilibrium interest rate, which when plotted gives you the yield curve. Okay, that's what the market segmentation theory told us. Lastly, we had preferred habitat theory. What did that tell you? Yes, there are each maturity is a different market, and investors have their own preferred maturity. I have a preferred maturity, you have a preferred maturity according to your investment appetite. Okay, and that is the maturity that we would like to invest in. Therefore, if you want to induce the investor to go for a longer maturity than your preferred maturity, you have to give an additional return. If the interest rate or the return given is attractive, then investor would move away from their preferred habitat or the preferred maturity. Okay. Now, just a question to you. A standalone investor, what would be their preferred maturity? Just a rational investor, what would be their preferred maturity? Obviously, if now let's say the return interest rate is a flat yield curve. Okay, flat yield curve meaning short term also same interest rate, long term also same interest rate. Then what tenor do you like? Obviously, you would like a short term tenor. Why am I going to hold a bond for a long term when the interest rate is same? Okay, so by default, a rational investor would always prefer short term maturities. Quick money for them, easy, they know risk levels are very low, uncertainty levels are very low, so that's their preferred maturity. Okay, so for them to move from this short term bucket, which is their preferred maturity, and move away to the long term, you have to give an additional premium. Okay, these were the heart of the theories. So out of these fundamental assumptions, fundamental learnings, what did we get? What was the implication that we got? We learned that from expectations theory, when they say interest rate of the long-term security is the average of the short-term interest rate, they were implying, look here, even if I invest in a long-term security or if I invest in a short-term security and keep revolving, both of us going to end up at the same interest at the end. On average, the impact is the same. So it was telling us bonds of different maturities are perfect substitutes. If I put my money in a 2-year bond at the beginning itself, that is for me. And if you go and invest in a 1-year bond and at the end of 1 year again reinvest for another 1 year, both of us would end up with the same average interest rate. Why? That's what the expectation theory suggests. Okay, we argued whether it was true or not, the pitfalls of such an assumption. Remember that as well. Okay, sometimes person might not reinvest, and then the person who invests in the long instrument is exposed to the interest rate risk as well. So from that implication, there were certain drawbacks. Okay, liquidity premium theory. So what do we learn from that? To induce investors to go for a long-term bond, you have to offer them an additional premium for that additional term that they are going for. you have to be compensated with a liquidity or the term premium to attract them for a longer term bond. Market segmentation theory, what did that tell us? It completely took a opposite stance of what a expectation theory was saying. No, bonds of different maturities are not substitute at all. They are completely different and independent. Each of them work independent to each other. Okay, what did preferred habitat theory tell us? It's very much similar to the liquidity premium theory. Yes, to induce investors to move away from their preferred maturity or to move away from the short term, you have to give a higher risk premium. Now, what you need to understand, the differing point is liquidity premium theory gave the term called you have to give the investor a liquidity premium or a term premium. Okay, but in the preferred habitat theory, they don't define the premium that they want you to give. Okay, they don't define it as a term premium or a liquidity premium. They say a additional return has to be given. Okay, so note the point. You have to give an additional return to entice the customer to move out from that preferred maturity. Okay, so that's why I have used this word called higher risk premium. When you move to the out of their preferred habitat, they expect a higher risk premium. Okay, so what were the other differing characteristics between these four? The dependence or whether it is linked to the short-term interest rate. Obviously, expectation theory is very much linked to the short-term interest rate. The long-term depends on the short-term interest rate. That was very well known. Liquidity premium theory, of course, yes. Why? It is also based on the expectations theory. So if the expectations theory also says long term depends on the short term, then because liquidity premium is an extension of the expectations theory, it also believes that long term interest rate is impacted by the short term interest rate. I hope I'm clear to you. Expectation theory says the long-term interest rate depends on the short-term interest rate. Okay, liquidity premium or is based on or is an extension of the expectations theory. So that also believes the same, but there is a differing point. What? Expectation theory says long-term interest rate solely depends on that short term. But liquidity premium says no. It depends on short term, but there is an additional boost called liquidity premium as well. Okay. Market segmentation? No. It doesn't have any connection. Market segmentation does not talk about anything to do with short term. It says each market is different. So no way long term is dependent on the short term. Each market is behaving on their own. That's what the market segmentation theory is telling us. But what is preferred habitat theory telling us? They like, investors like short term. For them to move out from the short term, you have to give a risk premium, higher risk premium. Okay, so if the interest rate for the short term increases, then long term interest rate is also has to increase. So there is an indirect dependence, very much similar to the liquidity premium theory. Okay. Does it suggest that yield curve are usually positively sloping out? Whether this theory says usually the common one that you find is upward sloping yield curve. Now, expectation theory doesn't say that. it gives us justifications for all shapes. But all the other three, liquidity premium, market segmentation, and even the preferred habitat theory, all three of them tells you, look here, usually you find yield curves to be positively sloping, and they have their reasons for that. Okay, and what's the very last differentiating factor? Does it justify why interest rate for different maturities move together? Now again, this very last point is linked to the third point here. Whether interest rate across all maturities move together, which means if the short term moves, does the long term move as well? So the same answer as the above. Expectation theory is highly dependent. It says, look here, short-term interest rates are the ones which decide the long term. So obviously, it provides a justification that interest rate across all maturities move together. If the short-term move, long-term also move. Liquidity premium theory, yes, they also justify that relationship. How? One is through expectation, other is through the liquidity premium. If the short term get a higher liquidity premium, then long term has to get much higher in terms of the liquidity premium. Okay. Market segmentation theory, does that give you justification? No. That believes short and long term have no relationship. They are all standalone markets. Therefore, it doesn't give you a justification that interest rate across all maturities move together. But if you come to preferred habitat, this is very much similar to the liquidity premium theory. Therefore, that provides an indirect justification. How? Preferred habitat is short term, but if you want to move out to much longer term bonds, I need to get a higher risk premium. So in case short term, initially it was at 2, therefore with the additional premium of 3%, if the long term became 5, imagine if the short term becomes 3, with the addition of 3, long term now has to move to 6. Okay, therefore again, preferred habitat also gives you the justification as to why interest rate across different maturities move together. Okay, so that should give you a clear-cut summary of what we spoke about. Now we are going to move to significance or uses of yield curve. So we draw the yield curve, we understand the shape behind it, we do all this, we go through the theories also. Why is it important for us? That's what we are going to look at. Now yield curve, we saw the very first or the most significant use is it tells us what the general public are expecting. What are their expectation or outlook for the future? Now, even here, when we went through the shape, we saw that the shape provided us an indication that, okay, market sentiment. Now, if you have read financial news, if you're a person who's reading newspapers every day, you would hear this word called market sentiment, market expectation. Why is that important? That sets the attitude of the people towards what's happening in the economy. Okay, so if I am very enthusiastic about the economy, about the future economy, I am very keen to invest. Okay. If I don't have a good expectation of the economy, I'm going to move out. I'm going to hold all my cash as money balances. Okay. So that's why market sentiment is very, very important to attract investors to a market. Okay. So this yield curve highlights to us what that market sentiment is, what that expectation is. Okay. So a normal upward sloping yield curve will tell us that long-term securities have a higher yield, and that's going to tell us in the future they expect activity to pick up, they expect economic growth to pick up, they expect the economy to move up and grow. But if it's an inverted curve, now inverted curves are very unusual in an economy. You don't see it as much. It happens very rarely. Okay. But if it occurs, it's like a cautionary point. Why? People, now I would go and invest in a long-term bond if I'm confident that I'm going to get my money back in 30 years' time. Correct? So that tells you that there is a market confidence about the future of this country or future about this economy. Oh, now imagine if I'm not at all confident, I'm not going to go get into a long-term bond. I would be keen on short-term. So inverted curve, which shows that short-term rates are very high, which means that people are very keen on only investing for short-term. They are not confident enough to invest for long-term. Okay, so a inverted curve highlights that. Okay, so the yield curve essentially tells us the general market expectation or the market sentiment about the economy's future and the future interest rates. Okay, now second one is very, very interesting. Now before we move to the second use, remember the general rule I told you, price and interest rate are negative, are inverse in relationship. When interest rate increases, price declines. When interest rate declines, price increases. Okay, we saw that. If you can just write down next to this. Okay, it is based on that we are going to see this use. Now looking at the yield curve or plotting a yield curve will help us to identify whether securities are overpriced or underpriced. Now, why do we need to know whether a security is overpriced or whether a security is underpriced? If you are an investor who's looking to buy a security, now remember, if you're going to buy a security, do you want to buy a security which is overpriced or do you want to buy a security which is underpriced? Obviously, you would look for the underpriced security. Why? You have a ability to get an additional gain there. Okay? But think that you are the seller. Okay? From a seller's point of view, you're already holding this security. And you understand the security that you're holding is overpriced. What do you do then? Do you still continue to hold? You know the overpriced scenario is very, very short term. So you would want to sell the security immediately before the price falls further. Okay. But imagine you are already holding the security and that security is an underpriced security, which means the price doesn't reflect its real value yet. Then you will continue to hold that security until the correct price is reflected. Okay. So whether you're holding a overpriced or underpriced security is very, very important. Now, how can you understand whether the security is overpriced or underpriced? by looking at the yield curve. Okay. Now, this is your yield curve. Now, you have a security. You have a 6-month security. Now, this is the, let's say this is the T-bill market. Okay. This is the T-bill market yield curve. But now you have a treasury bill in your hand, which gives you an interest rate of 1.5. Now, this is an anomaly. What do you mean by anomaly? It's a very rare occurrence. It's not in line with the others, but it's out. Now, this is your instrument. Okay. Let's call this the point A. This is point B. Point B is what the general market occurrence. Okay. Now, we know any kind of a anomaly or abnormal occurrence is short term. Okay. It will come back to what the market sentiment is, or the widely accepted market. Now, when you identify that you have a security which is giving you which is at this point A, what does it mean? It is giving you a high interest rate. High interest rate than the others in the market. Correct? It's giving you 1.5, whereas the others giving you 1.25. Now, when the interest rate is high, we know price of that security is low. Correct? So, which means A is a underpriced security. Okay. Currently, this security is underpriced. So, if you are a buyer, you will be very keen to buy the security A. But if you are already holding security A, or if you are the seller, you are not going to exit from this security now. You will continue to hold until the gap is nullified. Okay. So, if the interest rate of your security is above the yield curve, then that highlights underpriced securities. Now, let's think of the other scenario. You have a 6-month treasury bill. This is what the market expects. So, it's at 1.25. But your instrument is giving you 0.75. Point C. Okay. Is giving you a low interest. Now, in the market, for the same maturity, you are going to get a high interest rate, 1.2. Now, this is the same security as well. T-bill itself you are talking about. Okay. General market expects 1.25, but yours is yielding you 0.75, which means you are getting a low interest rate. Your interest rate is low. Now, when your interest rate is low, what happens to the price? Price is higher. Now, if you are the buyer who's looking to buy security C, is it recommended for you to buy? No, it's an overpriced security. Now, here interest rate is higher. Therefore, price is also lower. But here, interest rate is low and price is much higher. So, C is an overpriced security. So, as a new buyer who's looking to buy C, no, it's not recommended. But if you are already holding on to the security C, or if you are the seller, yes, good time for you to sell. Why? It's a short-term impact where your security has a higher price than the others. So better sell and move out. Okay. So if your security is having an interest rate below the yield curve, when plotted is below the yield curve, then it is overpriced. So simply, anything above gets you underpriced securities, anything below gets you overpriced securities. Okay, so by plotting the graph, you're able to identify what kind of security you currently hold or you're going to buy for. Okay, helps in business of financial intermediation. Now, what is financial intermediation? The very first lesson that we went through, you accept deposits from the savers and give out as loans and advances to the deficit units. One common entity which does this as a business, as their full-time business, is banks. Now, how do they do this? They accept deposits mainly. Now, for a bank, what is their main source of deposits? The CASA balances, the current and savings balances, low cost, and what they have as the highest. When you have a larger network, that's one of their major sources of deposits. Okay. Now, that is short term in maturity. But banks are going to lend as loans and advances mostly for long-term loans. It can be more than 1 year usually. If you take the proportions, tenor, the portfolio maturity usually takes more than 1 year. Okay. Now, can you see they borrow short-term, lend long-term? Okay. Now, let's take this diagram. Forget about this other curve that you have on top. Okay. Now, as a bank, what do you do? This is, of course, short term. These are the longer terms, correct? So what do banks do? They borrow short term, lend long term, correct? So if the yield curve is upward sloping, what happens? Banks can get a higher profit. How? They are borrowing short term, which is low in interest, and they can lend to long term, which is high in interest. Therefore, a upward sloping yield curve indicates to financial intermediaries, look here, you have an opportunity for profit maximizing or for profit earning. Okay. Now, this is a normal yield curve. Imagine your yield curve as before is a much steeper curve. Okay. If it's much steeper, what happens? Now your short term, which is at this level, could be again relatively low, but here your margin is very, very high. So a steeper yield curve, steeper positively sloped yield curve is going to indicate to you much larger profit making opportunity for financial intermediaries who do financial intermediation as their business. Now think about inverted yield curve. What happens here? Again, you borrow short term. That's what all banks do. They borrow short term, lend to long term tenor. But what happens here? The short term borrowing cost is very, very high. But whereas the long term is giving you much low in return. What can you tell about the profit making opportunity for financial intermediaries? Very, very low. So it's a low profit making environment, or it is a loss making environment. Okay, so looking at the shape of the yield curve, financial intermediaries can gauge on how their profitability would be. Okay, that is what is highlighted here. A steep upward sloping curve indicates higher profit. A flat or a downward sloping curve translate to decrease in profits, or essentially even a loss situation. So even if it's a flat one, your short and long term are going to be pretty much the same. So very low in profits, or even sometimes a loss situation. Issuers can use yield curve to price their securities. Now, very much more linked to our earlier one where we saw under and over. By looking at the yield curve for that particular security. Now let's see, let's say I'm going to issue a debenture. Before I issue the debenture, I would like to assess the yield curve for the debenture market. Okay, so when I go through the yield curve for the debenture market, I can see what the market is expecting. How, whether for a longer tenor, how is the appetite for a 10-year debenture, for a 5-year debenture. Okay, so looking at that appetite, I can understand where to price my debenture. Okay, what kind of an interest rate that I need to quote. So interest rate to quote essentially will determine the price of the security. Finally, this is a very tricky one. Investors use yield curve to do a strategy called riding the yield curve. They do a trading strategy with bonds, which is called the riding the yield curve. Now I'll tell you what that is. Now in a yield curve, you know this axis is maturity. Okay, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, then you have 1 year, let's say 12 months. Okay, now I am a bank. I have issued a commercial paper for 1 year. Okay, 12 months. Let's say I issued 1st of January. Okay, now let's say 30th July, 31st July. What is the maturity left? You have about, from August to December, you have about another 5 months left. So at that point, what is the maturity? It's going to be 5 months. So can you see from issuance until the maturity, or until your money coming back, in the yield curve, in an upward sloping yield curve or any yield curve, you keep moving this way. What do you mean by this way? Initially, you would have 12 months as maturity. Then when the time moves on, it becomes 9, 6, 3, and then ultimately 0 by the date of settlement. Okay, that's why I've highlighted through this arrow that you're moving this way. So in riding the yield curve, what happens? let's say initially your security had 9 months as the maturity, it had the interest rate of 1.5. When time moves on and when the maturity left for that instrument is now only 6 months, 3 months have already gone, it would carry a low interest. Now, when the interest is decreasing, what happens to the price? Inverse relationship, price keeps increasing. So from this point to this point, price has increased. So in riding the yield curve, what happens? Investors who have the maturity or who look for a maturity of, let's say, 6 months, they go and invest in a 9-month security. Okay. Now from 9 months, now what do you mean by 6 months? Their appetite is to hold the security for only 6 months. Okay. From the date of investment to the date of maturity, only 6 months. Correct? Now what happens here is they invest directly in a 9-month security. Okay. They invest in a 9-month security and okay, let's wait till the end of 6 months and quickly sell off at this point in the secondary market. When they sell off at this point, interest rate has decreased, price has increased. Now this I'm talking about the secondary market. Okay, so they can exit by selling it in the secondary market at a higher price. Why aren't they not waiting till the maturity? Because on maturity, it's your investment amount that you're going to get back your investment amount. Okay, but before maturity, meaning you can sell it off in the secondary market and you have the opportunity to get a capital gain. Okay, that's why they're investing in a 6-month security and waiting for 6 months. Sorry, they were investing in a 9-month security and waiting for 6 months, and they sell it off with 9 months, with 3 months to spare. Okay. If imagine they invested in a 6-month security and they wait until settlement, the company would obviously pay your principal amount back. You don't have an opportunity for a capital gain, opportunity to trade in the secondary market. But here you get the opportunity to trade in the secondary market where there is 3 months left. You can quickly sell the instrument which is now having a low interest rate in the market. Therefore, higher price can be commanded. So this is called riding the yield curve. It involves buyers buying a long-term bond with a maturity date longer than the desired investment horizon and selling it before it matures to profit from the declining yield that occurs over the life of the bond. Investors hope to achieve capital gains by doing this strategy. It is for that they do this trading strategy called riding the yield curve. Okay, I hope you're clear. Now we are moving to much interesting area. Now so far, all the interest rates that we have discussed are positive interest rate. What do you mean by positive interest rate? I have excess money, you need money. Okay, so when I give you 5,000 today, I expect you to pay me back with a positive interest rate, which means next month when you pay me back, I will get 5,000 and let's say another 100 as interest. Okay, positive interest rate. What do you mean by negative interest rate is, okay, I give you 5,000 today, you have to pay me back in 1 month's time. But at the end of 1 month, what I get is 4,900 only. Which means lender is now paying interest to the borrower for using his money. It's a very tricky scenario because practically we haven't seen it happening, at least locally. So it will be a bit difficult for you to narrate. You'll be wondering, how can that practically happen? Okay, but let's see when we move along. Usual scenario, what happens? Lender, the person who's giving you money, borrower who's taking the money. Lender gives the principal on the day of giving the loan, and at the end of maturity will get the principal plus interest. So borrower pays additional amount apart from the principal. Now what happens here is borrower pays only the principal, and that also a lesser principal than what he took. Why? He doesn't have to pay any additional money. It's negative interest. It keeps decreasing. Can this happen in a country? Of course. Why it happens? This is a very unusual policy tool used by economists when the economy is at its lowest, at a very bad state, or at a continuously deflationary situation where economic activity is not at all being encouraged, induced, or kick-started. At a last resort, probably they would fall back to negative interest rate, which means they are encouraging businesses. You borrow, you invest, put up factories, produce more by borrowing, so that there'll be more in the market and the economic activity will start to kickstart. Okay. In theory, negative interest rate can help an economy in following ways. Induce people and businesses to borrow and make investments which stimulate the economy. Now, imagine the economy where they are holding on to their savings. They are not spending it on consumption. So demand is very low. When demand is low, obviously, when there is market demand is very low, production levels would obviously fall back. Unemployment levels would be higher. So that kind of a environment, when you bring in negative interest rate, is it recommended for you to save? Will I be encouraged to save? No. Because what happens is each rupee I save, let's say I save 10 rupees and I put it in my bank as a deposit. Tomorrow when I withdraw my 10 rupees, I won't get 10 plus another 1 rupee. I will get 9 rupees because now bank is deducting the interest from me. So will I save in such an environment? No. I would say, why am I keeping it in the bank? I would rather spend it and buy something. Okay. So that will encourage consumption, which is our second point. When they encourage consumption, obviously market demand will pick up. When market demand picks up, obviously to cater to the demand, production has to be stimulated. So businesses or general public would be very keen to approach banks and borrow, get them as loans and invest in the economy. Okay. improve employment levels of the economy. So obviously when the production levels move up, the employment levels will also come back to normal or will get more improved. The unemployment levels will decrease, and that again will benefit the economy by giving it more income. Okay, so these are like the preliminary or theoretical good sides of a negative interest rate. But what are the downsides of a negative interest rate? Yes, it's a monetary policy tool that you use, but don't it cause any downsides? Of course it does. Who is it impacting more? It's going to impact mostly to the savers of the economy. The surplus units who are saving money are now going to get discouraged. If I'm earning a salary of 10,000 and I'm saving 8,000, what happens if it's a negative interest rate? I won't save 8,000 because I know if I save 8,000 in the bank or elsewhere, my money will keep decreasing. So I would rather spend. Okay. So what happens when an economy has no savings? Leads to the second point. No deposits to the financial intermediaries. The savings which comes as deposits to the intermediaries are very, very low. So think of a bank where deposits are decreasing. On the other end, borrowing is increasing at a very high rate. Why? Now the borrowers don't have to pay interest. If the company comes and takes a loan, bank has to give them interest. So obviously, even you and I will rush to the bank to get a loan in a negative interest rate regime. Okay. So in such a scenario, obviously, financial intermediaries are going to get impacted heavily. Thirdly, it's going to create a very big boost in the already existing wealth inequality. There's already inequality in wealth, and now that's going to get more expanded. The ones who save are going to get continuously eroded, whereas the ones who borrow are going to benefit. Encouraging businesses and households to take on debt, high levels of debt. Now, this regime or this kind of a policy tool encourages you to borrow. So, inside that scenario, what happens? We will obviously, so we won't have anything as our money. Why? We are not going to save, we are going to spend everything. So, imagine spending everything, no saving, but we take on more loans. That is going to be highly leverage. So the economy will be very high in leverage, and that is going to create a very risky environment. It's going to induce excessive risk taking, which is our last point. So in a negative environment, negative interest rate environment, people are going to be dependent more on loans or debt, and that is going to induce people to take on high levels of risk. If things or activities they wouldn't have done if the interest rate was positive, they would do all of them now. A bad business, a bad investment, they are not worried. Why? They're going to borrow and do. In either case, they have no impact. So that induces an excessive risk-taking culture to the economy. Okay, understand the positives and the negatives of interest rates. Negative interest rate. Now, why are we talking about negative interest rates now? Obviously, last year when pandemic hit us initially, we know lockdowns globally was going around, and that was heavily impacting economies. There were several economies who were trying to kickstart the economic activities. Therefore, many of them were actively looking at whether they need to adopt a negative interest rate regime. Now these are two interest rates which were nearly negative. You can see it over here, 0 to 1%. The Euro interbank offered rate hovers at that particular rate. Japan also in the same rate, because they are already in a very deflationary climate. They need to induce consumption. Okay, so once if they induce consumption, they want the country to move to more healthy levels of inflation. So they also operate in a negative interest rate regime. Apart from that, yes, there'll be very less buyers. So if it's an uninformed buyer, they are the ones who would buy a overpriced security. So if you're a more informed buyer who can, do your own calculations and understand how the market is going, you will be aware, overpriced securities are something that you're not going to touch. But if you're unaware about all these yield curves, how the market moves, if you're a new entrant to the market and such a, overpriced securities be enticed to you, recommended or marketed to you, you would easily fall for that and end up at a loss. Okay, so informed buyers are very less, but there can be uninformed buyers who are available for that security. Okay, I hope that clears your doubt. Sorry. So these are some of the articles that you find. German banks increasingly charge negative interest rates. Australian banks must have a plan to deal with negative interest rates by 2022. So these are the active occurrences that are happening in the market, which I want you to read up on. Why? You know what's happening in the economy. You will know what's happening globally. What is the need for them to push for a negative interest rate? Okay, so have some time left for you to Google, understand what's happening in the economies, especially global ones. We know you have a question where they ask about the central bank stance of global country, of other foreign countries, especially US, Japan and whatnot. So better allocate some time so you know the history of what's happening, at least the environment. So once it's closer to the exam, you don't have to memorize for you to know. You know it as a news, you understand it because you followed up. So it's easy for you to write as well. Okay, so imagine negative interest rate that you study is not just theory now, it is happening in the globe or in the world right now. Okay. Now we are going to move to the second part of the fundamentals of financial market, which is stock market efficiency. So far we have in detail covered interest rates. Okay, interest rates we know was like the important variable when it comes to the money or capital market, more specifically the debt market. Okay, debt related instruments. Now I have a question for you. Interest rates, do they have any impact on the equity market, on the stock market? Do they have any impact? Just for you to at least think from your end, just see, do they impact the stock market, or are they just standalone? Interest rate is only going to impact debt market, not the stock market at all, not the equity market at all. Of course not. We are in a financial system where everything is interconnected. Interest rate, though not directly impacting, it indirectly influences the equity market. Okay, That's a topic I needed to discuss with you. How? In two ways. One, interest rate is your opportunity cost. Okay, that is number one. Second, interest rate influences the financial cost of the listed companies, which indirectly affect the profitability of those companies, thus impact the stock market. Now, the very first point, opportunity cost is interest rate. Now, I am an investor. Okay, I have 10,000. Now, what are my two options? I can save it or put it in a fixed deposit, or I can put it in the stock market. Okay, just a rational small investor. Now, if my fixed deposit is giving me 15% as my interest rate for 1 year, what would I rationally think? I have no risk in the fixed deposit. I know 15% is my guaranteed income. I'm going to invest my 10,000, place my 10,000 as fixed deposit. End of 1 year, I'm going to get 15% interest. No fluctuation, it is fixed. Okay. But in a stock market, in equity market, when I'm investing, is my return guaranteed like that? No. Return can obviously fluctuate. Okay. It depends on the how the market price moves. So for me to move out from a 15% interest rate giving fixed deposit towards the equity market, my opportunity cost is very, very high. I'm going to lose 15%. So at least the equity market should give me 16% for me to take that risk. Definitely more than 15%. Correct? But given the risk and the volatility, and given that the rate is 15, I would might as well settle for the FD. But think of the current scenario. How much does a fixed deposit get? 5%, 6%? Okay. So putting the money for 6% annum. Okay. Per annum, I would only get 6%. But if I come to the equity market, same situation. High volatility, I can't understand, I can't guarantee my return. But now, my opportunity cost is only 6%. Earlier, I was losing 15%. So now, just 6% now, I need to make at least 7% from the stock market. In a year, 7%, okay, I think I might be able to. At least my opportunity cost is low. Okay, so in a low interest rate, because your opportunity cost is low, stock market attract a lot of investors. If you had seen or followed up news beginning at the early January, you would have seen a lot of equity market activities being picked up. Why? In a low interest rate regime, investors tend to move towards the equity market to get higher returns. Okay, so that is one. Second impact was financial cost. When interest rate is low, financial cost of companies are going to be low, which indirectly going to increase the profitability of the company. If the profitability of the company increases, what happens? Dividends from that companies are going to improve. Ideally, the return to the investor is going to increase. Okay. So how the interest rate moves is impacting equity markets as well. Okay. So that's how important interest rates are. Okay. I hope you're clear. let's go to the stock exchange. See, certain stocks, if you pick out the good stocks, you should be able to get high returns. So here, no. So see here, in a day, it ends up with a nearly 3% increase. So if your fixed deposit is going to get you a 6% interest rate for a year, an investor who's very used to trading would prefer the stock market. An informed investor, not a brand new one, informed investor who used to trade in the stock market would easily prefer the stock market. Why? Imagine within a day you earn a profit of 4%. Okay, it's that volatile. It can go up, it can go down as well. Now, when it comes to the stock market, you know how the stock market is arranged. You have listed companies who have listed their shares here. Their shares are traded in the stock market. So in the stock market, the day-to-day trading is the secondary market that we are referring to. It happens between investors. I sell, you buy. Company has no impact. Okay. Now, when we buy a share, let it be, okay, not a share, any security. Okay. When we buy any security, why are we buying that? We are expecting better income, better return to come in the future. That's why we are investing, correct? Similarly, we buy a share in the stock market. Why? We expect future return. We expect the company to perform well, and by that get more return. Now for a share, what are the ways that you can get your return? Dividend, capital gain. Capital gain is not guaranteed. It's not sure. It keeps fluctuating. Depends on the market environment. Dividend, you can fairly guess the company has to declare. Okay. So when you're trying to buy a share, you will assess the return and buy that particular share. Correct? So at a point, theoretically, they say at any given time, the price of the share reflects the present value of its future dividends. Why are they focusing only on dividends? Because capital gains is something that you can't mathematically calculate currently. It depends on the market occurrence. Okay. So what you can certainly know is from the past dividend data, you can anticipate the future dividends. Correct? So they say the current price of a share reflects the present value of the future dividend. Okay. If I believe this company is not going to perform well, not going to have a high profitability, therefore will not give me good dividends in the future, obviously I won't buy that stock. Correct? So behind that price, that is the indicator. Okay. Now, the price of a share reflects the current information, what we know about that company, what is happening in that economy at that moment. All of them are highlighted in a share. But when a sudden event occurs, what do you mean by sudden event? Let's say all of a sudden there is a news that you get, there is an import ban. Then you get the company is opening up a new factory. Or let's say there is a news saying banks are not going to declare dividends. Those are events which are unexpected. Okay, you don't expect that to happen in the normal course, but all of a sudden it occurs. Now, when that occurs, what happens? Now, price reflects what we already know, the expected future dividends, correct? Now, when that expected future dividend is going to get impacted by this news, what happens? Price quickly adjusts. Price has to adjust for that event. Now think about this. If you have a company which is listed in the stock exchange, which is selling white goods, imported white goods, and all of a sudden there is a news which says there is a complete ban on white goods. What happens? Business ability for that company to sell, all of those are impacted. Obviously, profitability is a question. Therefore, expected future dividend is now going to be a question mark. So earlier, hoping future dividend, I would have preferred to pay you 10 rupees to buy that share. But now, with this news, that is threatened. Now, I'm not willing to pay you 10. So quickly, price will adjust for that new news. Okay. Now, what are we going to study today is the efficiency of the market to adjust for this news, and how quickly are they adjusting, and are they adjusting to the correct degree is what we are going to look at. Okay, two things. When we speak about market efficiency, we talk about how quickly are they changing, and are they changing by the correct degree, by the correct amount. Okay, an efficient market will always reflect all available public information about that security quickly into its price. Okay, in an efficient market, all news, all publicly available information about that security will quickly adjust to its correct degree. Hence, it will be an efficient market. If at least one of them don't happen, if it doesn't adjust quickly, it's going to take a longer time to adjust, or it's not getting adjusted by the correct amount. Either the market is overreacting or underreacting. Then again, it creates an inefficient market. Okay. This means all available information is already impounded in an asset's price. So investors should expect to earn a return necessary to compensate for their opportunity cost and inflation and risk. They can't get any abnormal returns in an efficient market. Okay, in an efficient market, when a news comes out, the price of that security quickly adjusts, and it adjusts by the correct degree. So you and I don't have any room to use that news and get an abnormal return. No, we don't have time for that. If such a thing is happening, then yes, excellent. Your market is an efficient market. Okay. Now let me explain how that efficient market works. Now here you have a positive news release that you expect. Okay. Here it's a positive news release. At this point, okay. Before that, okay, let's say price of that stock was 10 rupees. Now 10 rupees was based on the existing public information, all what the investors knew, that was the price. Okay. Then all of a sudden you get a positive news release. But a good example is, okay, let's say you have a local tile manufacturer. Okay, local tile manufacturing company whose share price is 10 rupees. All of a sudden you get a news, imported tiles are banned for 2 years. Positive news to the local tile manufacturer. Competition is low, demand will improve. Okay, so moment the news release comes in or is made public, there should be an immediate reaction. Can you see this? Immediately price increases. And it should increase by the correct amount. By the correct amount, it should increase. Let's say due to this, the real impact to the company is their dividends, all that will improve, profitability will improve. So when you quantify the actual future price of that stock, could be in the range of 50. So once the news release is done, yes, price of this stock immediately changes to 50. Then this market is considered as an efficient market. Why? Change is quickly and the change is by the correct amount. Okay. But what happens in the practical life? Usually, or in practical, you can't always find efficient markets. Okay. You find inefficient markets. Why? Because investors either overreact to the information or underreact to the information. Okay. What do you mean by overreact? When you get a certain news, they exaggerate it and either the price shoots up much higher than what it really should be. Okay. Underreaction meaning they don't give its real worth. Okay. So that is one. Overreaction or underreaction. Other one is due to this over and underreaction, the time taken to react is going to be different. It's not an immediate reaction. Okay. Now here, the same example. What happens if there is a underreaction? Okay. Again, local tile manufacturer. Positive news is ban on imported tiles. Okay. So here, this was the existing price at 10. Okay. In an efficient market, it should immediately react and price should immediately react and go to its correct price. Okay. This is the correct path that it should have taken. Okay. But what happens is a underreaction. What do you mean by underreaction? It's a very good news. Okay. Due to this good news, the 10 rupees stock should ideally be 12 rupees. Okay. Now what happens is people either don't care about it, people have not realized that this is going to create such good impact on this particular company. This company can be a very small company or in the emerging state, people have not understood the positive impact for this company. Okay, so what happens is, even after the news is released, price is still 10 rupees. Okay, some now understand 11, 11.5. It takes a very long time for it to reach 12 and come to the correct price path. Why am I telling that this is inefficient? Because can you see at this point, after the news released, there is a time where it is still at 10. Okay. Now let's think, I am an informed investor. I understand that this news is going to create good impact for this company. Okay. I can use this underreaction. I can use this underreaction and get a high capital gain. How? Even after the new release, after the news came out, I can still buy the stock at 10 rupees immediately. Why? People still have not found about the real benefit. So I can quickly buy it at 10 rupees here, wait till the people actually realize the impact, sell it at 12 rupees and get out. Okay. Whereas in an efficient market, I won't have such time. Moment the news release came, price will quickly react. So I won't have any time to capitalize from this information. If I have already have the stock, yes, I will benefit. But if I don't have the stock already, just by getting the news, I can't capitalize on that news. Okay. Do you understand how that you can get an abnormal return when there is underreaction in the market? That's why you call this scenario a inefficient market. Okay. I have the ability, if there is at least one investor who is informed, they can use it and get a capital gain. Now imagine the person here who sold it to me at 10 rupees even after the news came. He is uninformed and lost money due to market inefficiency. Do you understand? If there is an overreaction, market price overshoots the new equilibrium. Here, okay, this is relatively big. Okay. So here what happens, same scenario, but now it's a overreaction. What happens in overreaction? This is the path that ideally the market should have taken. Ideally come here, it should reach here when the news release, immediately price changes to its high price. But now what has happened? Yes, people have understood the positive of this news, the benefit of this news. Now they have overreacted. Immediately, now earlier the stock was 10 rupees. From this benefit, the real price increase should be to 12 rupees. People have got so excited, it immediately shoots up to 20 rupees. Now what happens? When it immediately shoots to 20 rupees, market takes time for it to realize, no. It's not worth 20. Its actual worth is 12. So now it's going to take time for it to reach till 12. Now, uninformed investors would all quickly go and buy at 20, and then while they wait, price will come down to 12. They will buy at 20, and ideally price will adjust to its correct price, which is 12. They will lose out 8 rupees. If I am the informed investor, what can I do? If I already have the stock, if I have already bought it when it was 10 rupees before the news came in, I would know when it reached 20 rupees, look here, this is an overreaction that's happening in the market. The stock is not worth 20 rupees, only worth 12. So before I tell anyone, I can quickly sell it in the market for 20 rupees because there are unknowingly people who are willing to buy at 20 from me. So I will quickly sell at 20, wait till the price comes down, and then again buy it at 12. I get a much higher gain or additional 8 rupees. Okay. Or if I am an informed buyer, what should I do? I should know, okay, now 20 rupees is not the correct price. Real price should be 12. So I would wait till the price adjusts to its correct price. Okay. That's how they would ideally, overreaction would happen. Okay. So if markets are inefficient, time between the time of news revelation and the adjustment to the new equilibrium value, informed investors would make profit at the expense of the less informed investors. Okay. Now this is an image where it holds all three scenarios. Something is wrong. The keyboard shortcuts are not working. Okay, here you can see this highlights all three situations. Old value, this should have been the perfect efficiency. See, this increase should have been the perfect efficiency. But what happens under reaction? People take a very long time to realize. Or overreaction, people highly react and then it comes down. Okay. Now, studying these efficiency levels, Farmer came up with a hypothesis. He said markets, financial markets, are informationally efficient. That is the underlying assumption. Okay. Underlying assumption is markets are efficient. You can't believe market is inefficient theoretically even. So theoretically, he states the assumption that markets are efficient. All the information that is available is reflected in the financial market. Okay, there is no room for even the informed investor to make an abnormal return. Okay, that's what Farmer stated. But in his hypothesis, he identified the 3 degrees of efficiency. He said, correct, markets are efficient, but there are stages of efficiency. First one is weak form of market efficiency. He says, yes, markets are efficient, but in a weak form of market efficiency, the market prices of that, in the market, the asset prices reflect the past publicly available information. Yes, it reflects all information, but it reflects only past publicly available information. Okay, so any investor cannot outperform the market, cannot earn an abnormal return by using past publicly information. Why? Because it is already known to the market and the price is already reflecting that information. But if you know current information or information about this asset that is going to happen in the future, then you can earn abnormal returns. Okay, that's what happens in a weak form of market efficiency. Second, semi-strong form of market efficiency. Now here he says, okay, now this is a bit better than weak form. In the weak form, what did we say? Markets are efficient, but it is only efficient for past publicly available information. Okay, whatever that happened in the past, which are publicly available, yes. But in the semi-strong, not only past, even the current publicly available information are highlighted in the market. All those information are incorporated in a share price. So just because you read news, you went through, you understood what's happening in the politics or what happens in the country, you can't capitalize in the stock market. You can't get an abnormal return from the market. Why? All those information are in that asset price. Market has correctly and quickly reacted for those information. But if you have information about this company which others don't have, what am I referring to? Insider information. If you know some information which are essentially not publicly available, these are inside information, then you can earn abnormal returns in a semi-strong form of market efficiency. Okay. Finally, strong form of market efficiency. This is the strongest or the extreme version of market efficiency. Here, no one can earn abnormal returns. Why? Because in this market, asset prices reflect all the public information and private information as well. So just because you have some insider information, you can't earn abnormal returns. All information are highlighted in the current asset price. Okay, therefore, just by you having some insider information, you can't earn abnormal returns. So is there any other information that you're missing out? No. So in a strong form of market efficiency, you cannot earn abnormal returns. Okay, that's what Pharma stated. Now this is like a diagrammatical representation of what the efficient market hypothesis states. They state all markets are efficient, correct, but they are efficient to certain level of information. Now, in a weak form, they are only efficient for past publicly available information. Mostly these are trade-related information. Now, just by looking how the past price movement happens, you can't predict that in the future also price will move in the same way. Okay, so weak form is efficient only for past information. Okay. How can you outperform a weak market? How can you earn abnormal returns in a weak market? If you have current publicly available information or if you have insider or private information. Then we move to the second circle. Second circle already includes this, which means in a semi-strong form, Financial markets are efficient. They are efficient for past information. Correct. Now they are also efficient for current publicly available information, which means they are efficient for all publicly available information. So just because you read news, you cannot outperform the market. Why? Everyone knows it, and already price reflects that news. How can you outperform or earn abnormal returns in semi-strong market? By insider information. Only by having inside information, you can outperform in a semi-strong form market. Strong form market, it contains all information, public as well as private. Now, how are you going to outperform the market? No ways. So you cannot outperform the market. Okay. Now, another point for you to note is, you should know, trading based on inside information is wrong. It's not unethical. Why? Only some investors would have access to that, whereas others don't. So it's not a fair play, not ethical. So even though pharma states strong form to include private information, practically, as per empirical research studies done, strong form of market you can't identify in practical scene. Why? No market reflects private information. Okay, you can't, they don't already reflect those in the prices. If you have private information, obviously you have an advantage over the others. That's going to give you abnormal returns. So obviously the market can't be strong form efficient. Okay, so as per the researchers done, most markets are semi-strong markets. Those are not strong form markets. Okay, so these are the 3 levels of market efficiency. Now here he's telling it on a positive note. He is not saying market is inefficient. He's saying yes, market is efficient, but only for past information. In a semi-strong, only for publicly available all information. In strong form, it's efficient for all information. Okay, so using this according to how the market is, how the market efficiency is, you can identify using what information you can outperform the market. Okay, I hope that is clear for you. So with that, we will wind up the 3rd lesson we had for this lecture series. So we are done with fundamentals of financial markets. Next week, we are going to start money market. So from next week onwards, we are going to specifically look into the types of markets. Okay. I'm going to share my email address to you. I want you all to do something. So from now, tomorrow, we would start the weekly questions, which I usually do with the students. There's something wrong with this. Keyboard. Okay, something is totally wrong with the keyboard. Okay. How am I going to send you all my email address? If you can just note it down, Amanda Iresha. Okay, I'll tell them to share the information with you all with in the portal, so at least you can get access to it. You drop an email to my email address. tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, you all will get a 5 MCQ and maybe 4 essay type questions. Attempt that. Reply to me with that by Wednesday. I will go through the answers, correct it individually for you all. I won't be giving out as marks, but I will correct your answers, tell what went wrong, and give out the suggested or what the ideal answer should have included to each of you. Okay, so I'll try to share my email address with the institute and they will pass it to you. I'm very sorry, I'm unable to type it with the keyboard going all weird with the keys. Okay, so let's see whether we could start it off tomorrow or we'll start off from next Sunday itself. Okay, thank you so much for listening in. I hope you had a clear session today. We'll meet again next Saturday. Okay, thank you.